are all about the production here at Reclaim
I was
Hosting.
just thinking.
Well, we are here today, Taylor and I, with the esteemed Stephen Downs, who um, probably needs no introduction, but his OL Daily newsletter has been kind of the heartbeat of ed tech for as long as I can remember. In fact, in 2004, when I got a job as a starving graduate student in the City University of New York, I became an instructional technology fellowship, which is basically a new fellowship where we would help people understand how to use things like blogs and wikis to um, integrate into their classroom. Guess what? As soon as I started, they said, you should really read this website. And this website was the OL Daily. And so, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's great to catch up with you again and to talk to you about particularly hosting and the cloud more generally. But I want to start with a specific question. Back in 2004, 2005, or the like, where and how did you host OL Daily?
So let's see, 2004. I'd been doing it for a while by then. Like I started in my first website was in 1995. And I actually hosted that using a Glassy HTTPD server on my desktop in my office at Assiniboine Community College. And I did that because the computer services said, no, we can't host a website. There's no way to host a website on our network. It wouldn't work. So I installed that on my desktop, made it work, walked down to the computer services office, told them to open their browser to the specific IP. They opened their browser. There was my website.
I like, there's nothing like learning through Spite Shadow IT, right?
Yeah.
I feel like I've learned a lot that way.
Yeah. So for a while, so as long as I was with Assiniboine, well, that's not true either. Anyhow, I had a website at Assiniboine. Then I had a hosted website at, interestingly, a local hosting internet service provider called Docker, not to be confused.
Wow.
This
That is confusing.
Yeah, I know.
was using Docker in 96.
These guys called themselves Docker, and there was also this was in Brandon, Manitoba, and there was also another provider called CommonNet, and there's a whole Downs web presence on CommonNet that is lost to history because they went out of business and took my site with it. Lesson learned. Yeah. University of Alberta, I hosted on the University of Alberta website or internet service. But then I left U of A and basically got a bare metal server from a hosting provider based in Houston. 2 acquisitions later, it was a bare metal server on a hosting provider owned by IBM. That was kind of expensive, and I didn't like that because it was so expensive. It was like $100 a month back then. So by the time 2004 rolled around, I was still on the IBM bare metal server at the time. So, and that involved all the configuration that you can imagine. And I hated it, and I was not good at it. So I had just the very bare minimum. It was a website and my Perl scripts. And so I didn't use any tools. Anything I needed, I had to write a Perl script for. That was the only way I could make things work. And I've been doing that ever since. And my website still runs on those basic Perl scripts that I wrote back then after 20 years worth of editing on those Perl scripts. I was with a company called CSoft for a short while. They were Canadian hosted, but the load blew them out of the water. So and then I eventually moved over to Reclaim, the cPanel hosting on Reclaim.
So, I mean, interesting, and we'll talk about that, but it's interesting to hear, that story, not only all the different homes your identity has had,
Mhm.
but the fact that in order for you to publish at the magnitude you were, you had to also be a sysadmin.
Yeah.
You had to spin up your own bare metal. You had to understand that you could write Perl, which is a benefit, but like writing Perl is not the same as, managing or being a sysadmin. So how did that, like, how did you come into doing all that?
It's the webmaster thing, right? It's
Yeah.
end, front and end kind of,
Yeah. Well, that's what it was exactly. And I was Assiniboine Community College's webmaster pretty much for the whole time I was there. So, but again, it wasn't sysadmin stuff back then, right? It wasn't the same thing as it is now. It was much more basic than that. Like email, for example, all you did is you sent a request to send mail, and it was done. There was no configuration, really. You sent mail from your Unix ID, and you received mail through your Unix ID. It was easy. So, I say it was easy. It wasn't easy, but compared to what it is today, it was easy. It was so much more basic back then.
So that brings us to more easy, potentially, is cPanel, right? What was your transition from running your own server to then moving a lot of your stuff like your OL Daily, Grasshopper, which is your RSS integrated tool? Talk a little bit about the experience from going to managing your own server, because even when you manage your own server, by the time you finish managing it in the late 10s or 2010, 12, 15, whenever it was getting more complicated, right?
Yeah.
VPS was a lot more work. So what was it like to come back to cPanel or come to cPanel?
Well, and come to cPanel. Annoying. These systems like cPanel, and there are others like it, which we'll talk about, they're a mixed blessing, right? Just like any framework for anything. They make some things easier, but you have to learn this whole new environment, right? So coming into cPanel, I had to learn about cPanel. And, when you don't know, cPanel is no easier than just writing or just executing command line scripts, really. There are some differences, but so I learned as little about cPanel as I possibly could. As odd as that sounds, because I was pretty comfortable with the way I was running my website. So I got my site on the cPanel site, but I used FTP just like before to upload all of my files, or later on SFTP, which is a confusion all unto itself. So I'd write my scripts offline, upload them, test them, and maybe they'd run. Really, the only thing cPanel was doing two things for me. It was loading Perl modules. We'll come back to that in a sec. And it was handling email, and we'll come back to that. Perl modules. Now, Perl's really awful in a way, and they made a big mistake when they started it up, which is why PHP became the mainstream application. You had to be root to install Perl modules. And I was never root on any of these systems. I wasn't root because they were university administered systems. They were never going to make me root. Are you crazy? They barely tolerated my existence. So I always had to go through this whole process to install Perl modules. cPanel, you can install Perl modules, cPanel, but it doesn't always put the module where it really should go. And one of the things that happened with the Reclaim cPanel, which took me a while to figure out my way through, is that it installs the module in a local directory to the user. So a subdirectory from my personal root directory, right? Instead of where it would normally go in the system folders. My Perl script doesn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually had to write some scripting in all of my Perl scripts to direct it to use the Perl modules that were in my personal library. But I had to figure that out. I had no idea that that's what was happening.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that, go ahead. Sorry, Taylor.
No, sorry. I was like, and that makes sense. There's so many kind of similar things like that in cPanel because, you know, it is essentially from our perspective, like as the hosting company, it is a system to manage the fact that users don't have root on those servers, right? So in this case, it's like, here, we'll put your modules in kind of a weird spot. That way user B can have their own modules. But it does make things, in especially in the case of, I imagine, like Perl stuff. I don't know a lot about Perl specifically, but there's all kinds of analogies like that where it makes it a little bit more complicated for the sake of making it work in this kind of unconventional environment, you know?
Yeah. That's it exactly. So similarly with email, with email, I'm on cPanel, and of course it's all shared hosting. I have no control over the IP. At a certain point, that IP address got onto the spam people's radar. Nothing I did. Well, I don't think, anyways.
Yeah, we're investigating that still.
Yeah. But as a result, none of my emails were being sent. And so it became a problem, right? And it wasn't something I could fix and I tried. I sent email back and forth to Spam Assassin and other spam houses, the worst. They hate people.
It's true. They hate email.
Yeah, they hate email. Yeah. And basically they said, look, we're not going to do anything. It's based on your IP address. It's actually based on a range of IP addresses. And so long as you're in that IP, so long as you're within that range, you're going to be blocked. And that's when I first started investigating external solutions. What did I use? I used something else before Mailgun. I forget what it was. And naturally, there's somebody vacuuming outside here. Pardon?
Spark?
No, wasn't Spark.
Mail. Grid? SendGrid?
No.
It's interesting.
MailChimp.
MailChimp.
Oh,
okay,
yeah. Sure.
Yeah, MailChimp.
While you're talking about this, Stephen, it's something actually we still struggle with to this day, as you can imagine. Yeah. And I read an article that I found on OLDALI, and I have it somewhere linked, where, you know, essentially this is a kind of a confluence of the big mail providers like Gmail, like Office 365, working in tandem with these spam houses that make it next to impossible for small hosters like Reclaim to provide email with any consistency, or with any, and it's almost people like in tickets are like, why isn't my email going through? What are you doing? And it's like you were saying, on a personal level, we also feel on a company level, given that so much of this is out of our control unless you're part of the big player.
And it's a centralizing force, right? Because it used to be 15 years ago that it was like, oh, well, it's pretty hard to run a personal mail server. And now it's pretty hard for a small business to run their own mail server, you know, and I don't know what goes beyond that, but like, you know what I'm saying? Like it's some of it is at least understandable because ultimately they're trying to reduce the number of spam email. Yeah. This doesn't really work though. Like we're all getting spam email, like, you know, so.
Yeah, that's the very interesting thing, right? For all their efforts to, you know, reduce spam, the flow of spam continues unabated, yet perfectly reasonable people like me can't send their email. So I actually reached exactly the same conclusion you guys have. Obviously, I felt I was being like pushed to these central servers. Like they did not want me running my own email. I would have to use an email service,
Yeah.
and it's complex because again, I run my website off of Perl scripts, right? So I'm not just going to go into their web environment, which they would love, right? And make my email on their web environment. I have to write an API or an API script. And that's what I do even to this day. In my Perl script, I run an API that connects to Mailgun and sends my email that way.
So you are using Mailgun. I mean, it's interesting because we're kind of starting to. We talked about cPanel, and I think you both really did a nice job of summarizing, that space. The LAMP environment was a great environment to give many people access. Kind of very powerful little stack where PHP, Python, and Perl ruled. But then there was the moment after that. And that's when we can kind of start thinking about the cloud. But one of the post cPanel tools, I wrote a blog post just the other day talking about post cPanel tools. And so I haven't really lived in cPanel like significantly for a couple of years. And I think, Stephen, you and I have had this conversation on and off through your videos or in some other places. It's like I've been pushing my DNS to Cloudflare. I've been pushing my email sending to Mailgun. So when did that process start for you? I mean, was it basically because cPanel made sending email impossible? You had to go to a sending service like Mailgun.
Well, I was using Mailgun even while I was still on cPanel.
Got it.
Right. So my script was running on a cPanel site and connecting to Mailgun via the API. And I did that with MailChimp as well. They're both needlessly complicated services because they're doing a whole bunch of marketing stuff that I want nothing to do with. All I want to do is send email. So you have to learn a whole new terminology. Like it's no longer like in a mailing list, it's a quote campaign and crap like that. So like all the terminology is different, all the setup is different. I wish I could get out of that world, and I actually have looked at what it would take to run my own mail server again. Because even working with Mailgun, because of all the new systems that have come into place, like what is it, DMARC?
DMARC, exactly.
So and you have to litter your DNS server with those to make it work. So I figure, well, if I just host my own web server or my own mail server somewhere and do all of that and make sure that my IP address isn't on the blacklist, I should be okay. And that wouldn't be a whole lot more complicated than running an API to Mailgun and doing all of that, believe it or not. So, but I'm not at that place yet because I'm still doing this migration from cPanel to the cloud. But doing the migration would partially enable that.
Yeah,
there.
Yeah, the tricky thing that I think you'd find, but because keeping track of one server on the spam block list is tractable, but what we see more and more now is that there have always been, well, I shouldn't say always, but for a long time there have been block lists that are like, hey, we just list all of DigitalOcean. Every IP they own is just on the list permanently, and you can't remove it. And basically all the public cloud vendors are on that list. And so what you have to do is you have to find like, all right, am I going to put a computer, am I just going to do this out of my basement? Which I suppose you could do. Although I wonder if there's similar lists for ISPs, for consumer ISPs too. But yeah, it's hard. It's very hard.
Yeah.
I mean, we're reaching end times for email, really,
Yeah.
because they're basically locking it down, and
And
it's a commercial service now.
you know what's funny though, Stephen? So we have a relatively young crew at Reclaim Hosting,
Hmm.
amazing and young. But I was talking to them, and we're doing these ghost campaigns and email and using Mailgun, and the question came up like, how many of you use email regularly? And
Yeah,
pretty much none of them.
yeah,
They use messaging, Signal, they use
yeah,
Instagram, but none of them are using email except if they have to for very specific reasons. And
yeah.
I did kind of feel that sense that you're talking about. Like, my sense that email is the center of the world is simply because I'm old,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah, and that reflects the progression of my mailing list as well. Um, like I started it as RSS in '98, and my email started in 2001, and it peaked at about 40,000 email addresses. It's way down from that now, which is good because I couldn't afford it anyways. Because you have to pay per email that you send, basically. So I can't afford a big mailing list now, anyways. Um, but yeah, the number of emails has dropped off quite a bit. RSS has sort of been, there, and but it's the social media, and like I sent it through Twitter. A copy. Well, I'd send my OL Daily post through Twitter for the longest time. Again, just accessing the API, because once you've written one API, the next one's a little easier and a little easier. Um, and until I stopped using Twitter, that actually had a pretty good following. Similarly with Facebook, I was sending OL Daily to Facebook till I quit using Facebook. Again, both Twitter and Facebook just totally toxic environments. So I couldn't continue using them. Uh, so now the only social media I send it to is Mastodon, and that works all right. And I've got a few hundred subscribers on Mastodon, but it isn't big like the other social media is yet. I've tried to do it with LinkedIn. It's hard. It is not straightforward at all to use the LinkedIn API, and so far it's eluded me. I haven't given up, but it's a bear for sure. But yeah, and Signal, Matrix, uh, Telegram. I don't know where I'd begin with an email newsletter going to any of those services. Just people wouldn't want that.
You
I
should
don't think.
TikTokify newsletter.
I do have a TikTok account.
I'm sure you do. You're
Yeah.
everywhere.
I put bike videos and things like in nature shots and whatever on TikTok. It's pretty random and pretty infrequent, but it exists. But I don't know, like OL posts don't really translate to TikTok. Although I could AIify them, right?
Run them
just
through a video like Sora or something and have it read it off.
yeah.
I
Read
really-
it off and finish off with the link for more. Read this,
Mhm.
So Grant Potter linked me yesterday in a post to basically there's a FOSS site that's basically noting that when you link to their site on Mastodon, and then that site link gets cached across so many Mastodon servers, it effectively has a DDoS effect
I saw that.
this server, which is super interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's like the
Yeah.
links themselves, because they go across multiple servers,
Yeah.
essentially DDoS the site that's getting promoted. And so that's an interesting issue with Mastodon that people have found solutions for, to basically proxy links. But it just brings up a question about doing that on Mastodon might almost be dangerous, for your own site.
Well, yeah, you'd think, but this is where the Cloudflare comes in.
Yeah.
So I put all of my MOOC sites, all of those URLs on Cloudflare. Downs.ca isn't yet. That one's still in the transition because there's just so much involved with that. The MOOC stuff they were all simpler. They're all still Apache based sites, but I consolidated them all to a single cloud host. So I have one server and one set of scripts running all of the MOOCs at the same time, which is how Apache and Perl was set up in the first place, way back in prehistory.
Exactly.
So it's super old school, right? And that's how it was supposed to work, right? Your system administrator would run the web server and Perl, and then all the different subservices would use the Perl scripts that were centrally located. Which is a neat idea, but it never worked out that way because people, not surprisingly, wanted to write their own scripts. Yeah, so I've got my MOOCs running on Cloudflare, and that seems to be working fairly well. So I moved the DNS for them over to Cloudflare. I still have a registrar. What am I using? I'm using Internic as the registrar. Because it's a .ca domain, right? And I use Cloudflare as the DNS, and you can switch on or off the caching. When you switch on the caching, it works fine, and then if you get this cascading effect on Mastodon, you're not going to be impacted nearly as much because people are just accessing the cached version typically.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And just a little bit for the viewers out there. So we talked about Mailgun, which is a transactional mail service that allows you to kind of send mail. And then we're now talking about Cloudflare, which is basically it does a lot in terms of a service, but one of its main services is it allows you to point your name service for a domain to Cloudflare so that you can manage your DNS there. And as a result, it also does content delivery network or caching of your site's pages. And those are two tools that I listed in the post cPanel toolkit. So as you're moving to the cloud, these might be two things you're considering to manage your DNS a little bit easier across multiple services. And then to think about how you get email sent, because a lot of these next generation websites or tools that don't run on a LAMP environment or an Apache environment, as you said, have to use another tool to send email, or often have to, don't always have to.
Yeah, I was using cPanel for all my name serving. It's interesting. Now, life gets, of course, confusing once you also have SSL and server certificates. And cPanel does some management of that for you. And it's funny because moving my domains, my various MOOC domains from your cPanel service to Cloudflare, your system is now complaining that my SSL certificates are no longer updating because the site is no longer hosted on Reclaim. So every day I get 15, 20 emails. So I haven't put in, because I haven't finished the transition yet, I haven't put in the ticket, but eventually I'm going to have to put in a ticket to say, please turn that off. Your system still thinks it's hosting my SSL. Which of course it isn't. And of course, when you set up the cloud environment, you also have to attend to your own SSL.
Yeah. Well, I will say it's an easy fix for us. There's a spot in cPanel where you can tell it not to renew certain domains, or we can even remove the entire domain if you're not using it. So for anyone watching, but yeah. Right
now, about half my MOOC domains have been transferred, the other half haven't. So don't touch it, please.
No, I won't. But it's something we can definitely do. So.
It's an interesting point too, again, about another feature of Cloudflare, though, because as you move your DNS to Cloudflare, Cloudflare provides not only content or CDN, but it also provides SSL certificates, and that's
I didn't know that.
It can. Yeah, it's an option. I don't know that I don't remember if it's on by default or how that works, but if you're using their proxying, you can use their cert too.
Exactly. And that could save you a lot of money if you're doing SSL. And I have found that they work pretty much for most sites on Cloudflare. So that's another thing to think of, is taking care of your SSL.
I use Let's Encrypt for SSL
Right.
on the cloud site, and of course that doesn't cost me anything.
Yeah.
So any cost that Cloudflare would extract for that would be an expense to me.
Yeah. That's
So
right. Well, Cloudflare does that, most of that stuff for free. I think it's
Yeah.
really when you start getting into stuff like load balancing
Mhm.
or more sophisticated. They start at like $5 a month or
Yeah.
$10 a month. But most of their basic stuff is free. But
Yeah.
I'm not here to talk about Cloudflare entirely. I want to know, although I love it, I want to know, Stephen, what right now you're hosting on Reclaim Cloud, but also
Yeah.
because I follow you regularly and I follow your work, you've explored other cloud providers. I know you've been playing around with Cloudron. You've been doing other stuff. Like, what's your experience been as you start
Yeah.
moving your stuff to the cloud?
Yeah, just a quick note on Cloudflare. They're inexpensive and have free services now, but they're just the sort of service that once they get enough of the market, they're going to crank up the price. Count on it. I'm planning on that. So I'm not going to commit to Cloudflare in any big way, and certainly not for, I'm not going to get myself hooked
Yeah.
because I know they're going to turn the screws, because that's how these centralized services work. So what have I tried? What haven't I tried? Okay. There's the big three: AWS, Google, the Google Cloud, and Azure. Big, heavy, expensive, super complex system. These are for enterprise users.
Yeah.
Like, you have to devote a ton of time to learning their capabilities. Even simple things like identity and access management on Amazon, for example, that's a major effort in itself, just to create the right user who has access to the right services with the right billing for the services that you're using. And then they're more. Then there's the next tier down are both simpler and cheaper. So, and the main player in that tier, of course, is DigitalOcean. I've used them a fair bit. I'm not running anything on them now. They're still not cheap. And then there's also Fauna. There's the software is Fauna, and I forget the name of the service. But they hook people in by running articles on places like CSS Tricks, how to do such and such, right? And you follow their instructions on how to do such and such. And there's always a point where, and now you should install this Fauna specific script and make sure you host it on this service in order for the demonstration that you've been working on for the last few hours to work. And then that cloud service is kind of expensive. It's a trap, and I've seen it sprung a few times on me. Not that I was doing anything that was permanent, but oh, hey, wait, why am I anyhow? And then there's the next tier, which I would say Reclaim belongs to. That includes, let me see now. Vulture is one I have some stuff running on. Hetzner is very popular and very cheap, but there's the issue with Hetzner is they have very strict terms and conditions, and they're known to just punt you without warning or notice because they perceive that you violated one of their terms or conditions. So there's a risk running with Hetzner. Especially having to do with email, naturally, you cannot run a mailing list, period, on Hetzner. They just won't allow it. Vulture, they're a bit looser on that, but they're still like super squiffy. Hostinger, I have some stuff on them. What do I have on them? I forget. So the sorts of and of course Reclaim. So the sorts of services I'm running on these different services, the Cloud Run, for example, is running on Hostinger. So Cloud Run is a nice. Right now, all I'm using it for is the RSS reader. But I've got a couple of other things up and running. I'm just not using them. I have an instance of WordPress up and running on it. I have a bookmarking service up and running on it, but it doesn't work very well. And I think I have a PeerTube instance running on it, but I'm not using that. The main PeerTube instance that I'm running on Vulture. I'm also running, I've got Nextcloud running on Hetzner, and also an instance of OpenOffice for Nextcloud running on Hetzner. That's for one of my projects. And then on Reclaim, which I know is what you're really interested in. So I've got my Perl/Apache scripts system running on a couple of different clouds, one for MOOC, which I've mentioned, and one for my downs.ca website, which is mostly transferred over. I've also got an instance of WordPress running. I have my WordPress site leftish.media running on somewhere, but I forget which cloud service it's running on, but it's a different one. And isn't this ridiculous?
Yeah. How many services you're using is
it's kind of a hobby. but I've also got on Reclaim for my current project as well. I've got a PHP site. Now, I don't code in PHP, but I've spent the last 8 or 9 months coding in PHP for this website. So I've picked up PHP just recently. Eventually, you have to get around to it, I suppose. And then I've got a bunch of test sites running on Reclaim. Sometimes they're up and running. Often they're not. I've got a Node site running that posed some particular challenges for me. That's mostly what I've got at the moment. So the crowd, Vulture, Hostinger, Hetzner, you guys similar. You guys are a bit more expensive than Hetzner. Not a lot, but a bit. But you're a bit more open and easier to work with. Like, there are people I can talk to. Hetzner, you don't talk to people. Vulture, you don't talk to people. And they make it very clear in their terms of service when you sign on. You're renting cloud space. Everything else is up to you. All we do is keep your cloud up and running. But if your service runs into trouble, that's your problem.
Yeah. Which has always been our kind of like our niche, right?
Yeah.
Whether it was cPanel or now with trying to do some of the cloud stuff, we do have people who have some sense of that. Thank you, Taylor.
And we're definitely, it would make sense too, price wise. Like, Hetzner is a company that owns data centers, right? We don't literally own data centers. We're leasing hardware and things like that. So that makes sense. There's a lot of, once you get below the DigitalOceans and the they got bought by Akamai, Linode. That once you get once you go past that tier, all the companies, including us, specialize, right? So it's like you've got Hetzner and OVH where they don't offer service, but you can get a box from them for pretty cheap.
Yeah.
And you've got us where however you want to describe our niche, and there are probably other providers like us, and then there's some that are sort of between. I would say Hostingers kind of like that. Yeah.
The other factor too is all of the cloud servers, every single one of them, also has some software support. You guys, for example, use Virtuoso.
Yeah.
And the other services have their own thing. I don't know what the name of it is for any of them. So like the Cloud Run that I installed on Hostinger was one of these marketplace things, right? So basically you fire up a server and you select Cloud Run, right? You just off the menu, and then it installs it for you, and then you go with all of the defaults. And this has the same trade-off that you did with cPanel, right? You're getting this nice, easy service, but now you're involved with another application that you need to learn some of the ins and outs of. And the major challenges I've had with Reclaim have almost exclusively been because Virtuoso does its own thing, even on the what appear to be the plain Apache servers that you might fire up. It's still doing its own thing in the background, and it's offering services which are sometimes useful and sometimes not. One of those is the SSL, which Virtuoso has a built-in SSL that you can use, or you can run your own Let's Encrypt, but don't confuse between the two, otherwise you'll really get messed up.
Yeah, and especially because their thing is just using the built-in Let's Encrypt. However, it's scripted around to a huge extent. There's been times where I want to do something just slightly different. I go, maybe I just kind of see what they're doing and tweak it, and I go, no, I'm just gonna do it my own way, because they have to handle a lot of use cases to make it so that theoretically, as long as you're within their expected usage pattern, it'll always work, basically. But yeah.
Is it fair to say for Reclaim Cloud that when you're mapping a domain, you're probably best off also getting a Let's Encrypt certificate? And
100%.
Like, you can use the shared, but you probably want to avoid that, right?
Yeah.
If you have your own IP and you're doing a map domain.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, that gets a little bit tricky because the Let's Encrypt isn't available everywhere. So it's available if you're using the Nginx load balancer. Even if you're not using it as a load balancer, you just use it as the entry portal, and then you have Let's Encrypt as a module that you can plug into that. No problem, easy peasy. And then so you have Nginx, and then behind it you have your application server, which in my case is my Apache Perl box, or WordPress or whatever. And then behind that you'll have your database. Which is all very fine, but from the perspective of somebody who's writing script, you need to know where all these things are. Like my Perl script accesses the database. I need to know where the database is, and it's not always obvious how to do that. And it gets really tricky, in my experience, if in your application server you're running it as Docker containers. I found it's way easier just to use the application server as your container, which it probably is anyways, right? Rather than putting a container in your application server, because now you're gonna have to figure out where all of your connecting services are, like what to call them.
And this actually, I think, gets to kind of sort of the way that Reclaim Cloud's interface and Virtuoso that built it, or Jelastic, and then they acquired it, whatever.
Yeah.
You know, is it's trying to solve, and it's not always 100% successful, but it's trying to solve a couple different, like I would say, developer facing things.
Yeah.
And I actually think it's a sort of as a result of there are so many different ways we build web applications now versus, let's say, 20 years ago, there was only a couple infrastructure ways that most people would build web applications. And we still, the kind, I think, kind of cool thing is a lot of those methods from 20 years ago actually are, or at least still partially valid, right? You still can get a Debian Linux distribution in a container and install Apache and configure it yourself and do everything. You can do that. Most people don't want to, but you can, right?
Yeah.
And then so you've got things like Reclaim Cloud where it has, I would call them templates basically, or like, here, we'll throw Apache on there for you. We'll put a certain version of PHP. And if you want over here, you can run a certain version of a database. And we'll get those up and running, but now you have to figure out how they talk to each other. Like you said, you have to figure out, oh, this is the IP address, and they're on a LAN together. And then there's also the added thing of like, well, what if we skip all of that and do it in Docker, which is its own, technology you can use anywhere, right? You don't have to host Docker stuff with us.
Right.
But similarly, we have a template, so you can hit a button and get, here's a server where Docker's already running, and then you just run your Docker application. Yeah. And that's, on the one hand, good that there is variety, and it means that I think that we see people come to us and say, I just want to run my thing. It already runs in Docker. And we go, okay, here's what you do. And the opposite too. But it is really complicated in the sense that it's hard to know, like, is there one right way? And the answer is always no. It depends on how you want to do it.
And that's the big challenge, or was for me, is like, what is the way that's going to work for me? Particularly since I had different use cases going on at the same time. Like my Perl application, I call it Grasshopper. One of the things I wanted to do is enable other people to use Grasshopper, because it's a really powerful piece of software. It's kind of archaic, and it doesn't always work, and it has its quirks, but it does a lot. It does stuff that no other software does, which is why I continue to use it, because it's at once RSS aggregator, API, newsletter, publisher, whatever, database. So I find it really handy. But how do you, if you just use Virtuoso as Virtuoso with the load balancer and the way I just described, it's not really portable. I don't really have a way of getting Grasshopper out to people. So I thought, well, what about as put it in Docker? And I tried a few things. I had one Docker container that had all three of those things: the load balancer, the Apache, the database. I had another setup where I used Docker Compose and open up a few containers with each of the different pieces, which worked. It worked reasonably well, but it was complicated, and Virtuoso has its quirks, and it didn't always work perfectly. I had especially horrible forwarding issues. And I think most of those were based on old HT access files that I had. But you want your script to do the nice, post/number, whatever, instead of, page.cgi ? Post ID equals whatever, right? Which is, you support that with HT access. So I've been messing around with all of that, and all of that, the more portable you try to make it so that other people can use it, the harder it gets to try to set this up. So I kind of sympathize with the Virtuoso people trying to work with all these different use cases. But now I'm back to just run Grasshopper as its own application on its own server, no Docker, just the application, and put that on GitHub. And then if somebody else wants to containerize it, they can. Although, of course, they'd have to containerize the Apache server and all the Perl scripts plus modules. So, I mean, I have a custom Docker container which does that, but then we're back into complexity again.
So can I ask you, Stephen, is Grasshopper essentially a flavor of how you run your own OL Dally, or how you've run it for years?
Yeah.
Is it a version of that? Is that what Grasshopper can be described as?
Grasshopper is, well, the way I describe Grasshopper is it's my research lab. I use Grasshopper to run my homepage and my newsletter. I also use Grasshopper, and always have, to run all of the MOOCs that we created. I've used Grasshopper as a chat engine. I've used it. I used it once as a slide presenting tool, a back channel engine for conferences. So it's like a Swiss Army knife. Anytime I need to do something, I write some code and add it to Grasshopper. One of the challenges I'm looking at now is, because it's Perl, a lot of the things that I want to do aren't maintained in Perl anymore, especially with all the new API stuff. So, there's lots of sample script, for example, for JavaScript through Node access to an API, or Python access to an API, but no Perl access to an API. So I want to figure out how to run this other stuff alongside Grasshopper, the Perl script, and it'll all be Grasshopper, right? Sure. So, yeah,
it's your Moby Dick.
It's my Moby Dick. It'll take me down with it. Yeah. But it's funny, and I've noticed this through the years. You get old researchers or professors or whatever like me, and they'll have their own legacy software that they've been tinkering on for 40 years. And they're always on the mind, well, one day it'll be commercially viable. The guy's 85 years old. This COBOL script will one day be viable. And there is a market for this. And I'm realizing, oh, geez, I'm just like them. But so I'm resigned to, and I guess I knew that from the outset, because I would have taken a different direction. I would have tried to get VC funding or whatever, but I was always more interested in the coding than the commercialization.
But it raises an interesting question too, and a lot of stuff that Taylor's been doing for Reclaim that's been really valuable is, like, is there a way that by Dockerizing or by somehow capturing the work you've done over the years, it becomes an archive for other people to study, look at, understand them in a kind of vast, pool of folks who have made these custom softwares, almost like custom cars or custom creates that, weren't the kind of mass-produced tools that everyone fell to, but had their own uniqueness that are worth looking at and understanding. Is Docker a way to preserve that and maybe make that accessible, sometime down the road?
That's a really good question. And to me, it boils down to, is keeping it as a Docker container, does that involve less maintenance than keeping it as, say, a GitHub archive? And I don't think I have an answer to that. You still need to maintain the Docker containers. Docker still changes. It's better in many ways because the specific server configuration, the specific OS configuration that you need can be preserved in a Docker container. So in theory, you type Docker run and it should run. And to date, that's been true, provided that you're in the right hardware server environment for it to run. But I'm not sure how true that'll be in the long term. I just don't know.
I think that's exactly right, and that's my perception too. Is that the upside to running a service in Docker and having other people potentially use it later or right now is that you are starting from theoretically the same place when you're running something. And that's because it's declarative, right? So everything about your application is there in that code. It says start here with a Apache container or whatever, which of course someone else made, right? But you say this is the version of it that I want theoretically, or just the latest version if you don't think it matters. And then make these changes to it, but it always does matter, yes. And that's what I'm getting at, right? So it also depends on how strictly you adhere to that vision of I want to make this run in 10 years. And then there's another component of Docker, the whole value add beyond the fact that you can run these little micro containers or whatever is that there is a registry where you've got other services you can pull down. You can say, give me Debian with Apache installed already, and then I will go from there and build my thing and put it back in the registry, which potentially, which is great. And so far, like Docker Hub is the biggest registry, but you can host your own, and there are others. So far, Docker Hub, which is the one that most people use, has not deleted any old containers to my knowledge, but I don't think that's going to be true forever, right? Like I think eventually, like I did an exploration last year of like, what's the oldest WordPress container where you can just like say, I just give me WordPress already working in Docker when nothing else. What's the oldest one? And the what I found was basically as soon as Docker Hub existed, someone made, or probably Automatic or somebody made it. And that answer is WordPress 3.8, which is pretty old, to be fair, but it's not WordPress 1 because Docker didn't exist. Well, Docker didn't exist back then. My point is, but in 15 years, are we still gonna be able to run WordPress 3.9? I don't know, right? Like, not sure if at some point it makes sense to me that they're gonna be like, we don't really need anything before 2018, let's say.
Yeah.
I wish they won't do that, but
or
history
worse,
suggests they may.
They'll be available, but you'll have to pay for them.
Yeah, but there are theoretically that's not the end either. Like you can theoretically look at what are all of this registry, this stuff is diffable, right? So you can look at it and say, these are the changes, and you could follow that line all the way back, but it would be hard at a certain point. So I think it's accurate to say it can be easier, it can be better. It's not a guarantee at all. And I will say too, we have found weird things too. Like I've found certain cases where really old containers don't work as expected on a brand new version of Docker, and you have to make some small changes to like networking and things like that. And I'm not enough of a Docker person to say exactly why that's the case, but I'm sure it's the case of any technologies. Like stuff changes, right? So at a certain point, things don't work.
You may have seen my video series, Stephen Follows Instructions. I do about 40 or 50 episodes now. It's the world's least viewed video service series. But basically the premise is I find something like, those how to do such and such on CSS tricks or whatever. And some of Reclaim's instructions as well. I did the recent Reclaim Press one. I forget the proper name for that, but which worked perfectly out of the box, by the way. I was so impressed.
Ooh, Taylor, that's
okay. Actually, no, it didn't work perfectly out of the box, but it was pretty good.
I'll take it.
Take it, Stephen.
I'll take it.
There's always, with all of them, there's some point where the instructions are just like, no, I don't know what they're saying here. No, I
But you're a
get.
philosopher, so you're going to overthink all instructions. That's
Well,
a,
that's true, but I'm also a little bit of a technologist, so I can try to figure
fair
out
enough.
what they could possibly have had in mind. But to the main point, the majority of these that I try, and they're usually not that old, have expired. The instructions no longer work. You follow the instruction. A lot of them involve Docker containers. You follow the instructions, and you hit an obsolete library, a library that's been discontinued and removed because of a security problem, or a file server that's no longer active. Um, Something that just breaks the code irretrievably, and you're stuck. I call them blockers, right? And you can't continue. And of the episodes of this series that I've done, the vast majority have run into a problem like that. And I'm pretty sure it's not because I'm stupid. And it's partially because I'm stupid. But often it's just, there's just something that no longer works. So, and even Docker, right? I mean, Docker is going to be replaced by Son of Docker, which will be like Super Docker Lite with its entire. In fact, I've actually read about, because with Docker you're including the entire OS, and like all of Perl in my case, right? And really, you don't need all the entire OS and all of Perl. You just need the subset of the OS that you're actually using. So there are similar container services out there that do that, right? Just the part of the OS that you really need, and they're lighter and faster and all of that. Eventually that replaces Docker.
It's all cyclical too. Like at a certain point, we're like, what if it wasn't in a container? What if you could install a program and run it and you use your existing? And it's like, all right, now we're back to what we were doing. Got it.
Yeah, it's like, why don't the programs have the capacity to work directly with the machine?
Imagine the performance benefits,
Imagine the performance benefits. Yeah.
So, Stephen, as we wrap this up, and again, I want to thank you for being here with us. You've gone on this journey of kind of cloudifying, if you will, your digital footprint and doing that. So, what are some of the things quickly you've learned and advice you'd give to anyone who's trying to do some of what you're doing?
What have I learned? No, don't do it.
Okay.
No,
I got half an hour, I swear.
Okay, first thing is, you want to do it because you're going to end up with a lot more flexibility, and it's going to be cheaper. Although maybe not cheaper than Reclaim cPanel prices, but it'll be cheaper. Reclaim cPanel prices are like it's ridiculous. I don't know how you survive, honestly. But I'd say read the instructions, but that doesn't always work. But let's see, learning how SSH keys work, that's really important.
Yeah, I agree.
Working from examples is crucial. If you can find a working system that's doing something like what you want to do, follow that. That's always going to be easier than doing it from scratch. It's like the law of Docker containers, right? The higher level the Docker container you can get, the better, because they're doing so much of the configuration for you. If you can, and that's a big if, use the Marketplace app rather than the plain server. If you can. You can't always, but if you're doing something simple like a WordPress, or I guess do you have Marketplace for Mastodon yet? I think you do, don't you?
We have Mastodon, PeerTube, a handful of these, and I mentioned both of those because they're both kind of hard to run if you don't use them that way.
Well, exactly, right, exactly. So PeerTube.
We still can't get one for Discourse, and I know you've played with Discourse,
Really?
Stephen.
Yeah,
This is still a tough
I
one.
haven't tried that one since I started here, so maybe I'll have to give that one a
I
shot. But I know we have in the past. Yeah.
yeah, no, see, and Discourse has its quirks. I'm running Discourse. Where am I running it? I think I'm running it on Hetzner, and they did have a marketplace for it, but I have installed it, and it wasn't that bad. But Discourse. The trick with Discourse is making the email work.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lesson for you. Um, Learn, like, get an email account at something like Mailgun and use that.
Yeah.
Don't, like, all of these systems will say, use the built-in email. You can just use the built-in email. And it acts like it's all working and it's using send mail, but it's not sending mail.
Yeah, I'm actually doing that for my WordPress. I'm using
Yeah.
Mailgun to send, very simple emails from my WordPress using an
Yeah.
SMTP plugin.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I send email with WordPress, is with SMTP, the same plugin probably.
Yeah.
And the WordPress plugin for Mailgun is actually pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Yeah, you basically just drop it. I think you drop an API key in, and then it sort of takes over the PHP mail function, and anything WordPress wants to send, it just does it through Mailgun, which is pretty nice.
Yeah. Similar, and there's another lesson important. Google API keys are different and weird these days, where they're part of the security. You have to have two-factor authentication, and then you go into that, and there's a place that says set up an application-specific login, and then you go into that, and it gives you a one-time use API key. So it'll show it to you once and once only. Copy it and don't forget it, although you can just generate a new one, but then you use that and put that into the API slot for whatever application that you're using. That's tricky to use. So if you're trying to use Google services via API from any of these cloud applications, look up how to do it, because it does require the specific process.
I imagine with all the applications you're using just for your cloud services, you have a pretty robust password management system. Is that right? I mean, that to me would be like, less than one for what you're doing.
I use 1Password, which is pretty reliable. It's got its quirks again, and it gets confused with subdomains. And I have like cck.mooc.ca, ethics.mooc.ca. 1Password has some trouble with that sort of thing. And it will store the separate passwords, but it only goes by the top level domain in popping up the options. So you have to label your passwords carefully. But yeah, definitely I would not do it any other way. You have to use a password manager. I mean, it's craziness.
Yeah, it's almost like ground zero for an ed tech for me now. It's like password management, let's start there, and then everything else comes after.
Yeah. But the SSL or the SSH stuff with keys is basically going to replace that, is in the process of replacing that. And again, the documentation on that is crap. I hate to say it, but everyone assumes people are using Linux systems when they write this documentation, or maybe Apple. And nobody would use PowerShell on Windows, would they?
No.
But I do.
Oh.
I don't. I refuse to touch the Apple world completely. I just won't touch it, because who has the money for that? I mean, for various reasons, I use Windows, and so I use PowerShell. It used to be almost impossible to SSH using PowerShell because it just wasn't available in it. Now it is. And there's actually the whole Windows subsystem for Linux. The commands that that support Linux now also are supported in PowerShell. That's a relatively recent development. Made my life so much easier. But how do you use an SSH key in PowerShell, right? With Windows, they're always saying, "Oh, go use PuTTY." Well, it turns out there are different types of SSH keys, some of which work with PuTTY and Windows, others which don't.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, there's like the Open SSH standard, which is like
Yeah.
RSA and ED25. There's a few encryptions it can use.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what our documentation is around, because when
Yeah.
I personally, I use everything. I use Linux, I use Mac OS, I use Windows. Mac most of the time for work, but when
Yeah.
I'm not working, I use everything else basically. And I've never liked PuTTY yet. It's fine, it works fine, but it's just not my favorite thing.
Yeah, same here.
So I always recommend for folks who are getting started with Windows to use the OpenSSH client that's in PowerShell now. But I never keep track of if that's there by default. I think it's not. I think you have to install
Oh,
it.
you have to install it.
So
You have to install it. It's a simple install, and the instructions that you find on Google work no problem out of the box. But you do have to install it. But then once it's in, it works. But the keys, it uses the PuTTY style keys in PowerShell, and not the other Linux style keys. And the difference is, you can see the difference in the extension. The Linux style keys don't have an extension. The Windows keys do. They have the .ppk extension. Another aspect of this is, the presumption is, if you create the key, if you call it .id underscore whatever, and put it in, or not .id, if you just call it id underscore whatever and put it in your .ssh directory in your home directory, that PowerShell will automatically find it. PowerShell will not automatically find it. So you have to, when you SSH from PowerShell, you have to specifically tell PowerShell where your key is. And you use the -i option for that. So -i and then the location of that. To my knowledge, that is not documented anywhere.
So you want us to document PowerShell to feed your No Man's Sky addiction, which is fed by Windows. Is that what I'm hearing here, Stephen?
Actually, that's exactly what you're hearing. That's a very astute conclusion.
This is about No Man's Sky. PowerShell has nothing to do with this.
Yeah, well, except that, yeah, I mean, if I want to play No Man's Sky, I'm on Windows, and if I'm on Windows, that's where I'm doing my dev. But
I'm kidding, obviously.
Yeah, but a lot of people are in my situation, and who knows how many, because who can count them, right? And so a large proportion of the documentation that's out there for stuff, especially dev stuff, simply doesn't work for them.
Yeah, it's biased. Our documentation is definitely biased towards Mac.
Yeah,
for sure.
And that's
what
true.
we all run here.
We're a
so.
Mac shop, so that's something we have to work on. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think even I've been thinking about some of that stuff too, because like, you know, my the like SSH keys is just increasingly important, and it's really hard because it's not just SSH keys, but there's so many things like this that have a hierarchy. Hierarchy is not the right word, but like whatever. I'll go with hierarchy for now, of assumed prior knowledge, right? Of like, we assume you know how paths work, and we assume you know what the terminal is, and we assume there's a lot of assumed prior knowledge with something like SSH keys. And I do think we have an opportunity to kind of expand on that, because there's even like some of the SSH key stuff is weird. Like it will, even on PowerShell in my experience, use a key by default, but it has to be named ID underscore RSA or ID underscore ED25519. It can't have a custom name, otherwise it's not going to use it unless you tell it to. Right. So our documentation completely assumes that you have no other keys, because it's hard to pick a place to document. But I do think that we can. All the stuff can always be improved. So
Well, I have found, I watched the Stephen Follows Instructions videos for when I put out a series of instructions for getting Ghost up and running in a container on Reclaim Cloud. And you played with that, and I think you were playing with Mailgun and some of the other stuff to get Ghost. And what I found really illustrative watching those videos is just how much in my writing I assumed.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I am assuming so much just in my writing, and you're like, wait, what exactly is he saying here? And I found Tim Owens is better. He assumes less and often would get more specific, but it's very useful when you do those videos, just to reflect on, I got to go back and fill in a lot of huge ellipses that I have left out, details that people need. And that's the art of documentation. It is not easy. It
is not easy, and I'm really sympathetic with people who have to write it, having gone through all of those and then having had to write my own documentation on this, that, and the other thing. I'm really sympathetic, but it's also really frustrating sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
But the other side of it too, the reason why I do the series is because behind all of this is just a way of seeing the world, right? The sort of characteristic thought processes. This is what stymies, I think, a lot of people when they get into computing, is that even with people using a new program for the first time, and you guys have done this like hundreds of times probably. You install a new piece of software. What do? Try all the different commands, see what they do, right? So many people don't have that mindset, right? Their thought is they should be able to pick out the right command to do the thing that they want to do without having looked at what all the commands do. Or they think there should be a software manual that teaches you all of this or something like that, rather than trying all of the commands. And, so that's at the user level. And then at the dev level, it's another level up. What I'm trying to do is illustrate how I think these things through. And so I do a lot of thinking out loud when I do the videos, because I'm trying to show, here's what I'm thinking now. Here's what I'm thinking now. Here's what I'm thinking now, as I reason my way through it. And even instructions that are perfectly clearly written, there's still this thought process you need to follow. You need to have this perspective on the world in order to make those instructions work for you. I'm just trying to share.
Yeah, it's about so much of that assumed knowledge and assumed expertise. Assumed experience over years. You come to those, tutorials or to those documentations very differently than someone else would who doesn't have that base experience. But talking it through is interesting because, we share some experience in the field, but still I'm like, how did I miss that? Like, how did I miss that? We're on very similar spaces. So I can imagine someone who's coming to something like WordPress, for example, for the first time, it must just seem, and more so now than ever, like an island unto itself,
Oh, geez, don't get me started on that. I started working with, I worked with WordPress ages ago, and then I left it for like 10 years or whatever. And I picked it up again about 12 months ago to do some serious development on it. And like, oh my goodness, what did they do to it?
I don't know.
It's like,
Ghost is so
oh my
popular.
goodness. The Gutenberg system has got to be the most user hostile authoring and design interface I have ever seen in my life. It is awful.
That's being nice.
I'm sorry, but it is, and even that being nice, and I've been using it now for 12 months, and I've kind of to work my way around it and make it do what I want it to do, and I still think it's awful.
Well,
And I can see the kind of problem that they're trying to solve because I've written my own software called Grasshopper, which addresses many of these same problems and addresses them differently, I might add. So I can see the kind of problem that they're trying to solve, but the
I'll,
thinking, right?
I'll tell you, Stephen.
Sorry.
So I made, I've done a lot of my early work was around WordPress. WordPress
Mhm.
was the
Mhm.
simple solution to the CMS, the option.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I go in now and I say, okay, if I was who I was 10 years ago and I'm looking at WordPress now, there's no
there's
way
no
I
way.
would introduce this to a student and say, this is an
No,
easy way to publish online. Go
Mm.
forth and
No.
publish. And
Yeah,
that's a very weird kind of situation to be in because I use a
yeah,
very different WordPress. I use basically like classic editor, very few
right.
plugins and themes. It's the WordPress that I knew, and I keep all the other stuff out. But
Yeah,
I couldn't imagine, having to be in ed tech right now and managing to convince people that this is an easy, quick way to build
yeah.
out a website.
And that's why Ghost, as you say, is a better solution for somebody just starting out. Plus, it does email newsletters. So
It
if
and
you
it's
get email to work,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
It Ghost is interesting because they literally only support Mailgun. In fact, they have a whole web page about it, which is it gets you to understand where they are. They're kind of like, look, this is the one we support, and if you don't want to use it, you should use something else. It's like,
yeah.
okay, um, but
At this point, I'm like, basically, yeah, fair enough.
yeah, exactly. The interesting thing I will say, like as someone who, at least a couple years ago was working directly with students, teaching them WordPress, and like what I think the thing that's complicated with the whole WordPress situation, because I think I mostly agree with everything you're both saying, but what people say when they say I want to make a website means a few different things, and that's the tricky thing. And again, it's like I see why, I see what led them to full site editing, Gutenberg, those things. I don't really agree with some of the actual design of it, but
Yeah,
like you can see that they're like clearly this problem has to be solved because some people want a blog and some people want to design a web page, and they both want to use this tool.
yeah,
And I don't think how they've done it is at all perfect or even, I think there's a lot of room for improvement, but it's a hard problem, but to me it's sort of like that's not a problem I would have picked, if that makes sense. Like I always like personally tools that try to do one thing, and if you want to
Mhm.
do something else, use a different tool. And
Yeah,
I'm a little bit worried that WordPress could be at a breaking point if it tries to take on yet another problem that maybe I'm not foreseeing yet. And now we have three main things that WordPress is for. Like, what
yeah,
if they built in WooCommerce? What if it wasn't a plugin anymore and it was just part of WordPress? That could break it, honestly.
yeah. I mean, it got activated on me by accident one time when it was installed with something else that I installed with no intention of installing it, and it created complications for me, doing things that I couldn't understand why the site was doing this. And oh yeah, WooCommerce is installed. This doesn't work with WooCommerce. That doesn't work with WooCommerce.
Yeah.
Again,
Well,
this thinking though, right? Something's broken in WordPress. What do? Well, the first thing is check your plugins.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Then your themes, and then it's
and
probably HT access. And if
yeah,
it's not HT access, it's probably permissions.
yeah,
And then,
yeah. And there's this sequence, right? And it's just that's the sort of background knowledge, that the way of seeing the world
yeah.
that you have to have these days, anyways, to be in this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as you say that, one of the many reasons why we wanted to have you on is like you're going through that process of seeing a world that very well
Hmm.
differently as you move, from the more traditional server
Yeah,
environment to the cloud environment.
yeah,
And that's what I think a lot of people, this is my belief, will be going through now as, maybe they move off of cPanel or they want to simplify their single
yeah,
WordPress on something like Reclaim Press, or they want to have a place where they use many different tools like you are, and
yeah,
then have a place where they manage the DNS. I think the web is changing a little bit in terms of how you manage that single domain and how many tools you can run off of it and how many of them run outside the LAMP stack. And so that's an interesting new way of seeing how we run the web as kind of, technologists or just web citizens.
And I haven't even gotten to how Node runs so differently than the web. I hit the Node marketplace button and I got this screen authoring tool. And
that's right.
It took me years actually to figure out, and I finally figured out what's going on because I'm digging through the files trying to find, well, where do I edit this? Where do I put in my Node application, right? Using FTP and all of that. And of course, you don't do that at all. You put your code on GitHub and then the Node installation will automatically ingest it. Well, who knew?
Yeah, Node and like the whole ecosystem of NPM around it, the package manager, is something I personally am just now like learning about. I don't know that much about it, but I am to the point basically where you are. I'm like, okay, if I have some Node code that I think works, I know where to put it. And like it's really it's a fascinating system that I think if I took a lot of time to learn, would probably be valuable, but it is very different from most of the things I'm used to.
Which is a great promotion, Taylor, for your Ghost one-click installer in Reclaim Cloud. Ghost is a Node application.
Well, and that's one where I decided to punt that problem, and I said I don't want to learn about Node. I'm just going to run the Docker version of it.
I'm really liking Ghost these days. We run Reclaim the blog in Ghost. We run Roundup in Ghost. I'm really liking it. It's easy to edit. It's easy to publish. It's very no nonsense, and I think that's what drew me to WordPress, right? So,
but is it an RSS reader?
It's not. It's not. But they are adding. I'm very interested in following their ActivityPub support. They're building it right now, and the thing that they're doing that WordPress doesn't do, because WordPress has activity support if you install a plugin, but Ghost. They are building a reader into it, which is cool. So I'm curious to see what that actually looks like when it's done. But that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it'd be the full ActivityPub rather than just publish on ActivityPub, which is what WordPress basically does. Yeah. Although I think it pulls in the comments too as comments. Yeah, I think so, yeah. ActivityPub is the future, or the Fediverse is the future. I don't know what that future will look like. It might be horrible like email, but...
When's Grasshopper getting ActivityPub support?
Well, right now it links via API to Mastodon, so I read right from Mastodon. Sure. That's all I've needed so far. And that's been actually available for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years more.
And that's probably what most people would, want to do. I think it's interesting because ActivityPub, as a protocol or whatever, views everything as a node. It's like, oh, you could subscribe to the person's Mastodon or their WordPress site. But I don't really know if that's how people think of their identity online. Like, I kind of would prefer to give people one place, and that's something I'm struggling with.
That's the thing I'm kind of waiting on before I implement ActivityPub full on in Grasshopper. The Fediverse needs an identity solution. Even like I have a Mastodon account for me, Downs, and I have a Mastodon account for OL Daily, and that's what Grasshopper feeds into that, right? So it read writes from that Mastodon account. But so the rest of the world, those are two completely separate identities, and there's no possibility of a single person being behind them. And then I also have a Mastodon account on CoSocial, which is a useful and noteworthy, socially valuable Fediverse co-op service running out of BC. That's Boris Mann and some others. Yeah. Again, completely separate identity, right? So I have these 3 Fediverse accounts that really should be joined by a single distributed identity that doesn't exist yet. And that's the problem that needs to be solved for the Fediverse to actually work. And then if you want to join the Fediverse, you'll just create your identity somewhere and then just pick the services that you want to use and send messages to or read messages from or whatever.
It's like EduGlue, right? It's like the same problem.
It's the same problem. It's now somebody else made EduGlue but yeah, it's the same problem.
Same problem.
And it has to be something that people could understand why they would want that unified ID and how it works. That's going to be, I think, the trickiest part. It's not so much a technical thing. I mean, it is a technical thing, but that's easier, I think, than actually explaining to people what this does and why it matters.
Yeah, this is where OpenID failed, right? Because we sort of almost had it, but nobody created OpenIDs.
Exactly.
And so we got Google IDs and Facebook IDs and Twitter IDs instead. Of course we did, because as soon as OpenID came out, Google joined the consortium and then basically killed OpenID, just like they did with RSS.
Yeah.
So, but now 10 years later, we actually do need something like that.
Exactly. Like we need RSS right now, or some version of it. Like I agree with you. Like never have we needed it more.
Yeah, I mean the ActivityPub, following and content sharing is basically just an API version of RSS, but without identity solved. And so that'll be the next iteration. It will be addressed. I know there's enough discussion of it in the field. I don't know if it'll be addressed successfully, but it'll be DID or something else. It might be an entirely new protocol. So instead of HTTP or whatever, it'll be a protocol like DID : / or something like that. Might be, right? And then each person would get their own DID as this protocol. But again, making it obvious why we need it, and not like I ran a thing from Digiday today saying like marketers just can't wait for something like this, because now we'll be able to track people without cookies, because they'll have to authenticate into every web service that they go to. And they're like, that's exactly the wrong reason to have a distributed identity system.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it's got to be something that's actually enticing to people, and they have to have a reason to use it, and simple. And I had an issue today where I had a video going live streaming on YouTube, and the person went to YouTube and the video wasn't there at the exact moment that they logged on, because it started up a few seconds later, and it was too confusing. So it's got to be simpler than that.
Exactly.
And and again, I'm really sympathetic, right? It seems like, how could they not know just to wait until the live stream started? Well, how would they know that? If I didn't know, I'd be sitting there saying, well, I did everything right. I followed the instructions. I'm here, and yet I don't see it. I must have done something wrong.
Yeah, which makes the prospect of us solving distributed identity through ActivityPub a little bit overwhelming right now. But we can. We have the technology.
We have the technology. We just... I was about to say we just need the business case, but no.
I'd prefer we didn't have that, but
out of
you may be correct though.
But we do have Reclaim TV, and yet another awesome episode that I want to thank you, Stephen, for spending so much of your valuable time sitting here talking about your experience on the cloud, but as usual, sharing your vast knowledge about the field and everything in it. So thank you, Stephen. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, it's my pleasure to join you, and keep up the good work.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye, everybody.